much. I should have written a shorter introduction for you to read, but I appreciate it. It's a great honor to be here and to deliver the Holt lecture. I had the opportunity of talking with the Dean and Professor Ed Rock before this, and learned a great deal about your great law school and great institution and the leadership that the Dean is providing. I want to just, if I may, divert for just a second to recognize my dear friends from my Harvard Law School days, now Judge Jack Jacobs and his wife Miriam. Jack is a judge in the Supreme Court of Delaware, and we've been very dear friends for many years. We live in an era of astonishing change. Change that is occurring more rapidly across a broader array of areas than ever in recorded human history. It touches everything from the way we work, our families, the way we communicate, and in addition, it has geopolitical impacts on the way nations interact. I want to discuss with you in this Holt lecture 4 global forces that are shaping this century, a century in which all of the young people here will undoubtedly become leaders, and which I think challenge us in ways no generation has been challenged before. The first major global force is the dramatic shift of economic, political, and military power from the United States and its Western allies to the nations of the East, particularly China, Russia, and India, and to the South, especially Brazil. There were a few fleeting moments when the collapse of the Soviet Union left the U.S. as the world's sole superpower. A bright, shining moment when it appeared that a Pax Americana was afoot, with America set to benignly reign and tower over the world and guided in the direction of American-style democracy, free markets, tolerance, stability, prosperity, and peace. That period, if it ever really existed, certainly has ended. Now, let there be no mistake. America remains and will remain for the foreseeable future what Madeleine Albright, who the Dean was gracious enough to mention, called the indispensable power without whom no major problem facing the world can be solved. There remains and there will remain for the foreseeable future no country that has our unique combination of global economic strength, worldwide projection of military power, scientific and educational base, and creativity. But American power has always, really since our founding, not very far from this building, always been an upward trajectory compared to other countries. And what has changed is that while we remain preeminent in so many fields, our lead in virtually all of them has narrowed and is in the process of continuing to narrow, particularly with respect to the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. We now live in a multipolar world with a number of nations asserting their newfound power. While we may be the principal power, it's increasingly the case that we have to share that power with others. And as I'll describe, the Great Recession through which we have gone, and in which we're only now beginning to recover, only exemplifies and underscores this shift in power. And indeed, the European sovereign debt crisis, through which our Western allies are going as we speak, further adds to this notion that power is gradually seeping from the West to the East and to the South. I could talk for a very long time about that crisis. Maybe we'll talk about it in the Q&A period. But let me say this. 2012, this very year, will be the first year in recorded history in which global GDP growth will rest predominantly with developing countries. Over 50% of global GDP growth in 2012 will come from the developing countries. 40% alone, even though their growth is slightly declining this year relative to the last several, from China alone. A really astonishing notion. This shift has occurred for a number of reasons. One is due to oil and gas, the dramatic shift of wealth and economic and political power that goes with it from the consuming nations to the producing nations in the Persian Gulf, Russia, and Latin America. For example, at $100 per barrel, which is what we're at now, McKinsey Global estimates that Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE alone will earn almost $8 trillion in oil revenues between now and 2020. Oil and gas provides Russia the capacity to bully its neighbors like Georgia in the Ukraine, Belarus, and even influence Germany, a key American ally which is increasingly dependent on Russian natural gas. Iran's energy sources give it the means to pursue its nuclear ambitions and to leverage China and Russia into diluting or even opposing sanctions on its nuclear program. Brazil has just found one of the most extraordinary offshore oil reserves anywhere in the world in decades, and within the next 5 years will become one of the largest oil producers in the world. And Venezuela's oil wealth feeds Hugo Chávez's anti-Western activities and its alliance with Russia and Iran. Now, we share some of the blame ourselves. From the household level to the federal level, over the past 10 to 15 years, we have lived beyond our means, consuming more than we produce and borrowing the difference, translating into shifting trillions of dollars into the treasuries of Beijing and Delhi, the Gulf states, and elsewhere. So that China now holds more than $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury debt and bonds from Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, essentially becoming our foreign banker. Almost half of the U.S. government debt is held by foreign creditors, up from 13% only 7 years ago. We're the world's largest debtor. The Great Recession has punctuated this shift in power. Just think that an entire industry, the investment industry, which we invented starting in the 1840s, which survived the Civil War and 2 world wars, evaporated almost overnight because of the global financial crisis. Our largest Wall Street banks teetered and needed massive bailouts, as did our largest insurance company, AIG. Undercutting the capacity for us to hold out what we used to call the Washington Consensus is the model for the world to follow. That is, liberal democratic governance, free markets, fiscal and monetary prudence, flexible and open and often self-regulation. And what happened is we failed to follow our own consensus. We preached it to the world, and then we abandoned the very model that we were selling. Over the last 10 years, the top 1% of our population has had a spectacular growth in income of some 300%, while the bulk of the population has had either no inflation-adjusted income growth or actually lost income, creating one of the largest income inequality gaps of any country. The net worth of the average American household in 2010 was lower than it was in 2001. Now, mind you, we're not the British Empire crumbling after 2 world wars. As I indicated, we will remain the largest economy in the world, but we're challenged as never before. What we need are massive investments in education and research in development and infrastructure, including, may I say, on the Amtrak train that I took. Together with increased savings and genuine deficit reduction of the kind that the Simpson-Bowles Commission suggested. But with our polarized politics in Washington, we're frozen in inaction in dealing with these major challenges. We have come out of the Great Recession slower than developing countries, particularly China, which used their stimulus for massive investments in productive, fast rail lines, and highways, bridges, and infrastructure, which will pay dividends for decades to come. We're increasingly moving into a world dominated by two economic powers, the US and China. The rise of China is a stunning and astounding development. I was in the Carter White House in 1979 when we normalized relations with China. And just as one sort of humorous caveat, Deng Xiaoping, all 4'10" of them, ruling 1 billion people, came to the White House. And you mentioned trade. What he wanted most of all was what we then called MFN treatment, most favored nation treatment, so they would get the benefit of the lowest tariffs we offered anyone else. And he knew that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was really aimed at the then Soviet Union, would be a potential bar. He had clearly read up on it. He, during the meeting in the cabinet room, pushed a blank piece of paper and a pencil to President Carter, and he said, "Now, I know that the reason the Soviets don't get MFN treatment is because of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which bars countries which preclude immigration from getting MFN treatment." Now, he said, "Mr. President, write down on this piece of paper the number of Chinese you would like us to send you each year, 1 million, 2 million, 20 million. China is now the second largest economy in the world, overtaking in the space of 3 years, leapfrogging Germany and then Japan. And by mid-century, maybe earlier, maybe as early as 2035, becoming the largest economy in the world. They're investing heavily in expanding and modernizing their military. They've overtaken Japan as the premier political and military power in Asia, next to the United States. And with growth a staggering 10% in recent years, they have an unquenchable desire for energy and raw materials, so that they make special bilateral deals, no strings attached, with countries like Sudan. There are 750,000 Chinese workers living in Africa today, working on projects they're financing throughout the continent, and by the way, doing precious little training of African workers themselves. China has weaknesses. We shouldn't think of them as some juggernaut that we can't compete with. Their per capita income is far below ours. It ranks 104th in terms of per capita income, $2,400. They have several hundred million people at or near the poverty line, and between now and 2020, some 300 million people will move from rural to urban areas looking for jobs, a number equal to the entire U.S. population today. They have restive populations in Tibet, unrest among their Muslim population in the western desert region of Xinjiang, and with all of this, there are a sort of natural reaction by Asian countries to Chinese power. Who would have ever imagined that a country with whom we were at war and lost 58,000 soldiers and seemed to bomb into oblivion, Vietnam, would now be coming to us and asking us to help them stand up against China? The U.S.-China relationship will be one of the most unique and fascinating for all of you to follow in your lifetimes. It's unlike that of any other bilateral relationship in recorded history. Why do I say that? First, because of the size of the two countries. But second, because it is a relationship in which the two countries have essentially different values, different governing systems, different sets of national interests, and yet, a relationship in which we are mutually dependent, sort of like Siamese twins joined at the hip. We need each other, and we know we need each other. And so we will, and we are finding ways, notwithstanding the vast differences in our societies, we are finding ways to work together. The second major global force, and one, by the way, I think where we have a unique advantage over China because of their closed society, which ultimately is totally at variance with the direction of the 21st century, is the phenomenon of globalization itself, which I define as the total breakdown of national boundaries by economic, financial, and technological flows, and increasingly by the flow of people. It has created a generally healthy mutual interdependence in which we are indeed tied together as a globe in ways never imagined. When the largest individual shareholder in the New York Times is Carlos Slim, a Mexican of Lebanese origin, when the owner of the New York Nets basketball team is Russia's richest man, you know something is happening to bind the world closer together. There is no such thing as an American product or a Chinese product or a European product. I'm on the UPS board. Our supply chains for the globe stretch throughout continents. You can't produce any product in this country or in Europe or in China or anywhere else without having pieces of it supplied by other countries and other regions. So that if you shut one down, like the tsunami did with Japan for auto parts, it affects everyone in the world. The iPhone, I should say the BlackBerry, I may be the last user of the BlackBerry. I'll go to my grave using it instead of the iPhone. But the iPhone is made of components from 7 different countries. And by the way, you think it's made in China, right? 7% of the value of the iPhone comes from China. It's assembled in China. But the components come from all over, and that's a good thing because it means that the world is mutually dependent on each other. Communications technology is one of the key foundations for globalization, creating a more intimate and interconnected world. And this is not a phenomenon limited to the rich countries of the world, those people who can afford to go next door to the Apple store. Absolutely not. In fact, more than 2/3 of the world's mobile phones are being used in developing countries, enabling them to leapfrog the old landline copper wire communication systems. Global and internet access has skyrocketed. In 2008, nearly 1/4 of the world went online, double the proportion in 2002. And internet usage penetrates to the smallest villages in rural India and in African countries, promoting global communications, facilitating long-distance learning, allowing the creation of new jobs and new entrepreneurs. Breakthrough technologies like Google open a world of shared knowledge, and Facebook and other social media allow young and old alike to communicate across national boundaries, to have global friends, to create an interconnectedness we could never have imagined in a different era. Tiny cameras and cell phones produce images which go worldwide in an instant on YouTube and have major political impacts, as they did in rallying the opposition to the fraudulent June 2009 Iranian presidential elections, and as they have done in 2011 in catalyzing the Arab Spring. It's very difficult to imagine the Arab Spring being able to occur 25 years ago, because with YouTube, it instantly allowed the crackdown that the security forces were held to go worldwide. I often say to myself, as one who has spent decades on Holocaust work and got $8 billion in recoveries, and I continue to do that as a special advisor to the Secretary, if we had had the internet, if we had had YouTube, could a genocide of that proportion have been permitted? Now, yes, the Irans and Chinas of the world have found very effective ways to wall off their countries and wall off their people from the internet. But just as effectively, young people are finding ways around that. And ultimately, there is no question in my mind that repressive governments can only do so much to limit the ability of their citizens to connect with the rest of the world through the process of globalization. And the more they try, the further they will fall behind, because it means that technology, ideas, innovation, creativity will not be possible in those countries. Cable news has created a whole new dimension in politics, both good and bad, with 24/7 instant news cycles. And institutions like Al Jazeera, the Qatar-based cable network, has profoundly changed the Middle East. It had a major impact on the Gaza war with Israel. I think selectively showing images, but nevertheless it had a very profound effect, and their coverage of the Arab Spring made the Arab Spring happen, because it broadcast to the entire Arab world what was happening when a young street vendor in a suburb of Tunisia decided to burn himself and set off a profound change that I'll discuss in a moment. Now, there are for sure dark sides of globalization, and we would be remiss in not focusing on them. Cyberspace and the internet, which undergirds so much of our 21st century economy, are widely used by terrorist groups and criminal gangs as safe havens for planning, finance, and recruitment. The Obama administration has created a new position called Cyber Czar, and the Pentagon has a 3-star general heading a new cyber command. And there is a potential, indeed I would say almost a reality, of a new international arms race, not in traditional arms, but in cyber arms. Perhaps the first example of a cyber war started in 2007 when Russia decided to disable the entire financing system of Estonia. And then, a year later, began their war with Georgia by cyber warfare, shutting down many of the defense systems and missile systems in Georgia. And of course, most recently, only last year, the first skirmish in the Israel-Iran battle occurred with the Stuxnet worm, which was used to infect the centrifuges, make them spin at uncontrollable rates, and try to damage the Iran nuclear program. More on that in a minute. But the point is, we are eclipsing our capacity with technology to manage this new arms race. We've had arms control agreements going back for decades with the former Soviet Union. I was involved in some during the Carter years, we had some in the Clinton years, and we've had one major one in the Obama administration. But that's old stuff. Trying to get your hands around how to control cyber attacks when you can't even trace their location immediately is an enormous challenge. And a challenge, by the way, Dean, of international law of the first order of magnitude. There are other downsides to globalization, and that is that when a problem occurs in one region, it infects others very rapidly. The 2008-2009 financial crisis started, if you think of it this way, in neighborhoods all over the United States, when mortgages were packaged together from Elm Street, State Street, little towns and villages all over the country, and put into giant packages and then sold as securitized mortgages bought by major financial institutions, rated AAA by our rating institutions, and bought by people all over the world and financial institutions all over the world, except they weren't AAA rated, and when housing prices inevitably went down, they had never done in 50 years, then the consequence was not limited to the United States. It had global impacts, just like the Eurozone crisis is having impacts on our growth, on China's exports to Europe, because Europe is its #1 destination, not the United States, for their exports. We're all in this together in this globalized world. And that's a good thing. It's dangerous because mistakes in one region or one country can infect others who are performing well, but it's positive because it gives everybody a stake in making sure that there is some global oversight, some global governance. And may I suggest that we're starting, both in the legal and non-legal fields, to come to terms with this globalization. The G20 is a concept that recognizes that the old G7 model of the sort of developed democracies is passé, that the new countries, the new emerging powers, want to have a say-so and are demanding the say-so. And they're getting extra votes and extra quotas in the IMF and in the World Bank to match that influence. That makes it more difficult for us. It makes it messier to manage, but it ultimately, in my mind, gives them a stake. It gives them an equity in the enterprise, in a common enterprise. And that, again, is a positive thing. Let's look at some other examples in the legal field, for example. The Energy Charter Treaty, which unfortunately we did not accede to, but in which I was involved, has created a mechanism by which energy complaints by investors in places like Russia and elsewhere can be managed. The European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg issues binding rulings on human rights cases in Europe, including against Russia, and they are enforced and enforceable. It's one of the least known major institutions, and it's really effective. The International Criminal Court, although again we signed but didn't accede because the Senate didn't ratify, is prosecuting war criminals from the former Yugoslavia to Rwanda, to Liberia, to the Balkans. And that's a positive thing. It creates a global concept of a rule of law. It takes the Nuremberg trials and the concept of wars against humanity and broadens them so that people can be held accountable when they initiate genocides. There are global UN institutions for all the criticisms of the UN. The Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Health Organization, and as I'll discuss a little later, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which are creating global patterns of cooperation and rules of law. And let's look at two institutions which were almost laughable in terms of their lack of impact until very recently, the Arab League and the African Union. The Arab League was a paper institution, and yet the position that they took on Libya, in effect goading the West to support action against Gaddafi, and just this week, the action which they promoted in the UN General Assembly after the Security Council, because of Russia and China, vetoed an anti-Assad position. They went to the Security Council, 137 to 12, supported and initiated and sponsored by the Arab League, calling for the resignation of Assad. remarkable. The African Union has troops fighting in Somalia against radical Islamic groups from a half dozen African countries. So we are learning fitfully, yes, but we're learning that this globalized world means that we have to work together because we are all mutually at risk if we descend into chaos and bigger than neighbor. A third major trend is the battle for the direction of the Muslim world. And this is going to affect all of us, directly or indirectly. It is important not to see this in the minds of my former colleague at the Carter White House and a great professor and a great mind, Sam Huntington, as a clash of civilizations. For sure there are clashes. Obviously there are. I mean, when inadvertently NATO troops burn a Koran, or when cartoons appear in Danish newspapers, there are obviously clashes of civilization. But permit me to say that the basic issue in dealing with the Muslim world is not the clash between Western civilization and the Muslim civilization. It is rather the battle within the Muslim world for the direction of 1.6 billion Muslims from nations as diverse as Indonesia, the largest Muslim country, and India, the second largest, to the Arab Middle East. It is that battle which is the most important, and it is a battle at multiple spectrums and multiple levels, and with multiple complexities. At the far end of the spectrum are the Islamic radicals, significantly sponsored and supported by Iran, but not entirely. The Al-Qaedas, the Hezbollahs, the Taliban, the Hamases of the world. But I believe, and I hope this is not a naive belief, that this is a wave of the past. It will be with us for a very long time. It will occupy your young lives in the way it will occupy what remaining decades I hope I have. It's not going to go away. It has to be dealt with very forcefully. It threatens countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan in significant ways. But I believe that the real issue is what's happening inside the Muslim world. Internally, what direction will they take? And here let me focus on the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring has had a remarkable set of impacts in only a year. 4 autocratic leaders, 3 of them staunchly pro-American, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, are essentially gone, and the 4th, Gaddafi, and a 5th, likely, Assad. The geopolitics of the sort of neat division of the pro-Western autocratic governments, the Mubaraks and the Ben Alis and so forth, arrayed against the radicals, Iran, their terrorist organizations that they support, has been really sort of blown to smithereens. And it's like taking a house of cards and throwing them up and seeing how they land with great uncertainties. But more than geopolitically is what's happening also internally. Now, it has to be said that the young, largely secular, high-tech savvy kids who helped generate the January 25th resolution in Tahrir Square and in Tunisia have largely been sidelined, have largely been unable to organize, have largely been unable to develop a common agenda, have splintered into multiple parties, and by succeeding in removing the autocrats, they created a vacuum. And politics, just like nature, abhors a vacuum. Someone's going to fill it, and it's been filled not by the kids who brought this on, but by the Islamic forces, which were the most organized and were ready for this opportunity. It was they who were delivering social services in villages and towns when the government was too corrupt and unable to do it. And they had a platform, and they're ready, and they have won every election. Indeed, if you go back actually before the Arab Spring to the Gaza West Bank elections, it's not coincidental that it was Hamas that won, not Fatah. There's been a consistent pattern in every single election since the Arab Spring, whether it's Morocco or Tunisia or Egypt, that it has been the Islamic parties that have won. But, and this is an important but, we would make a mistake to end the discussion at that point. I just came back from a conference in Marrakesh in Morocco, and I came away with a positive feeling that in both Tunisia and Morocco, the Islamic parties which have won are genuinely, not in a propaganda sense, moderate, tolerant, anxious to have Western investment. And in Egypt, which will be the crucible for this internal battle for the direction of the Arab mind, because it's the largest country, the most powerful country, there's no question but that the Egypt today in geopolitical terms is going to be very different from the Egypt we knew. It's going to be more distant, not necessarily antagonistic, but more distant from the United States. It clearly will be more distant from Israel. But even in Egypt, with the Muslim Brotherhood having won 45%, and the Salafists, even more fundamentalists, over 20% of the parliamentary elections, and therefore having the right to write the election, the new constitution for the elections, and for the future of Egypt, even there are some flickers of hope. The Muslim Brotherhood may well align not with the Salafists, but with the weaker secular forces. And again, I hope I say not naively, I do not believe any of these countries are going to go down the path of Iran after the '79 revolution, which I can assure you I was right in the middle of. I lost my job in the '80 election because of that part. You're not going to see these countries descend into a fundamentalist, theocratic Islamic state. And indeed, the very exercise of power may have, and I think will have, a moderating influence, because now they have to deliver. It's one thing to criticize Mubarak or Ben Ali for corruption, for not delivering services, for not having clinics and medicines. It's another thing when you don't have anybody else to point to because you're the government and you have to deliver. And you have to create jobs and economic opportunity and deliver social services. And that, I believe, will be their preoccupation. I don't know if you have, Dean, a course in Sharia law. If you do, I would suggest not taking it, because it's nice to know. I think it's important to know what Sharia law really is. I'm not being facetious about this. It ought to be part of everyone's study. Seriously should be. But The reason why I make that comment is because these countries are going to be much less focused on implementing Sharia law, which doesn't put food in the belly, than they are creating economic growth. Here is Egypt, only a month ago, saying, no IMF for us, we're the new Egypt, we're not going to be part of this Western world. And what did they do last week? They got an IMF loan because they were desperate for it, with all the conditions that come with it. So I believe that this is the best antidote to radicalism. It gives the young kids who were hopeless, who were unemployed, who were attracted by radicalism, another alternative. It has empowered Arab publics. And if they will take that empowerment, and if we can help in our own more modest ways to shape the direction, then it gives these young kids another alternative to radicalism and terrorism, to make something of their own country, to participate in creating new institutions. And yes, again, we can help, and it's obviously profoundly troubling that they've got, the National Democratic Institute and the Republican Institute officials and the Freedom House, where I was vice chairman, those people are under arrest. In the end, that will be resolved, because it has to be resolved. So we're going to go through a lot of bumps in the road. It's going to be messy and difficult. It's going to be less predictable. But mind you, this is a revolution as significant and as profound as the revolution in 1989 and 1990, which ended the Soviet Union and which led to the freedom of Central and Eastern Europe. Put it in that context. This is real, it's major, it's big, it's going to, in a major way, affect geopolitics, but it's not necessarily in any way all a negative. Now, for time purposes, I'm not going to get into Afghanistan and Pakistan because it would take a whole time. Suffice it to say that this is one area which is so far immune to these positive developments. Afghanistan is a failed state. It cannot support itself. Pakistan is the most dangerous place on earth. It has the fastest growing nuclear force. It has a Pakistan Taliban anxious to depose the civilian government. It has massive corruption. It's supporting at the same time they're getting billions of dollars from us, it is actively supporting through their ISI security institution the Afghan Taliban, which is killing our kids. And the kind of positive forces which are occurring elsewhere are not yet present there. But I do want to end this one, before I go to the last global force, I want to end this on a more positive note. Because what is happening even before the Arab Spring meant that there were positive developments. So let's take Saudi Arabia. Shocked in 2005 by the Al-Qaeda attack, King Abdullah has done a number of very important things. In 2008, he hosted an international interfaith dialogue, including Jewish representatives, saying that nothing can purify Islam's reputation except for the extension of Muslim hands to the brothers of other religions. He's created a new King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, model on U.S. universities, with co-ed students and co-ed faculties. And the same thing is happening in Qatar with their education city and in Dubai's Knowledge Village. Slowly, gradually, the Arab world is going to integrate into this global economy. Even in the Palestinian territories, there are some positive developments. And let me again close this section with a positive note. As a result of the dismantlement of many of the checkpoints, I was just at the World Economic Forum in Davos with Saad Fayyad, the Prime Minister. Their growth this year in 2012 is likely to be 10 to 11%. Last year it was 9%. Growth is exploding. And perhaps the best example is in Jenin, which had been the center of terrorist activity. The U.S. is training thousands of Palestinian police. They are so effective that the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, have pulled back. Those Palestinian police are enforcing the peace. They're going after radicals. And this is beginning to happen throughout the West Bank. And the less radicalism there is, the more the checkpoints go down, and the more growth and opportunity there is. The last set of global forces I want to discuss are non-traditional security risks. There are many of these. I want to focus on two in particular, but we could also talk about energy and demography with 7 billion people, but time doesn't permit that. Again, I'll be glad to take questions on it. I want to focus on two of these non-traditional security risks. The first is non-proliferation. There are very few global forces of the 21st century of more importance than dealing with nuclear weapons. At the height of the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union had 70,000 nuclear warheads between them. And yet, for all the mutual threat, the U.S. and USSR controlled their nuclear weapons tightly, and there was a balance of what we call mutually assured destruction, where both sides realized preemptive nuclear strikes would bring a nuclear Armageddon. Today, there are 20,000 nuclear weapons, far fewer than during the Cold War, and that number will continue to decline. But ironically, as President Obama properly noted, and I'm quoting, "In a strange turn of history, the threat of global war has gone down, but the risk of nuclear attack has gone up, because while the major countries are reducing their nuclear stockpiles, the capacity to produce nuclear weapons has spread quite significantly." It appeared prior to 9/11 that nuclear proliferation was yielding to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to U.S. and global diplomacy. In the last years of the 20th century, for example, we successfully engaged a number of countries: Argentina, Brazil, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, South Africa, Taiwan, and yes, in 2003, Libya, to abandon their nuclear weapons programs. This, however, unfortunately appears to have been a pause before the storm. And now we're perilously close to a new nuclear age, with more countries joining the nuclear club with smaller but growing arsenals like India and Pakistan. Indeed, Pakistan is increasing their nuclear arsenal faster than any country in the world, and they've done so largely with the help of H.U. Khan, and it was his network that allowed nuclear technology to flow to North Korea and to Iran. One has to talk now about Iran and their developing nuclear project, because it is the greatest threat to an integrated, globalized, peaceful world. It has the greatest potential to blow apart so much of the interconnectedness, so much of the positive things that I've talked about today. Now, I think at one level, Iran has demonstrated that it is profoundly out of step with the Arab Spring. They brutally suppressed their June 2009 demonstrators, and they continue to suppress their internet, their users, and they are a really brutal military power. But I want to focus on the nuclear position because, in my mind, if they were to acquire a nuclear weapon, the threat is less that they'll use it to blow up Israel, for which I think we have very strong anti-missile defenses. Israel has the capacity, and they know it, to blow up Iran many times over. It's rather that it profoundly changes the balance of power in the region. It makes them even more aggressive in supporting terrorist groups because they feel that they would be behind a nuclear umbrella. And it may be the beginning of the end of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Because there is no way the Egypts and Saudi Arabias of the world are going to stand pat while Iran develops a nuclear program, and they do not. Now, where do we stand on Iran as of this moment? Well, you can read the papers too. Let me just give you my own views. The first is that there can be now, with the latest IAEA report, no real doubt that they are going down a nuclear weapons path. I believe that where they want to end up is what's called the screwdriver effect. That is, they want to be in the position of having all the components to build a nuclear weapon and deliver it in miniaturized size on top of a missile that can reach Israel and large parts of Europe as well as the Gulf. But they want to stop just short of putting all the pieces in their hardware cabinet together, knowing that if they did, that would bring grave and probably military action against them. But they want to declare that they are nuclear capable and be able to demonstrate they are, and they are unfortunately very close to that level. They already have enough enriched uranium, which if further enriched to 90% would create enough for 4 to 6 bombs. They're now increasingly, in their new generation of centrifuges, enriching to a 20% from a 3.5 to 5% level, for which there is no civilian need, absolutely no civilian need to go to that level. But if they go to 20%, which they are now doing, that makes it much faster to convert to the weapons grade levels. Be done within a matter of a couple of months. And that's the direction they're headed on. And as the IAEA said, there are many other issues, nuclear triggers and certain certain blocks that they're creating to duplicate nuclear explosions, for which there is no explanation for a purely civilian program. So the question then is, what do we do about it? What are we doing about it? And are we on a path which can stop this march to nuclear capability and perhaps ultimately to a nuclear weapon? Let me suggest that if a country like Iran, controlled by radical forces, particularly the Revolutionary Guard, wants to wreck its own economy and totally isolate itself for purposes of getting a nuclear capability, they may be able to do it. The question is whether the pain is so severe that both the populist and elements within the government, including, by the way, Ahmadinejad, who accepted a 2010 agreement to take part of their nuclear fuel out of the country and have it reprocessed by France and Russia so that when it returned it could not be made into a nuclear weapon. He accepted it, Khomeini and the Ayatollahs and the Revolutionary Guard did not, but sufficiently so that other forces blocked them. Now, I think there is a possibility, and a real possibility, of that happening. Why do I say that? Iran gets 80% of its export revenues from oil. 50%, one half of their total budget, depends on oil exports. The European Union, and I can say Dean, I thought I knew the European Union pretty well. I would never have imagined, even 2 years ago, that the EU would have said, committed themselves, not just committed themselves, as of July 1 this year, to stop buying any Iranian crude oil. That means that Iran has to shift its focus to Asia. India's already said that, notwithstanding our new nuclear agreement with them and mutual democracies, they're not going to retard their purchases. China has essentially said the same. But 17% of Iranian exports go to Japan, and almost 10% to Korea, where we have very strong leverage. If we can get the Japanese, and the Saudis are willing to fill the gap to say that they're going to follow the Europeans, that is a crushing blow to Iran. In addition, under the new sanctions legislation just passed by Congress and signed by the President, we are now targeting the central bank of Iran. It's a very profound step, by the way, to target the central bank of a country. And that means that it is extremely difficult for countries to transact oil deals with Iran, because the central bank is the clearinghouse for those. In addition, there is in Brussels a system called the SWIFT system, which is the data exchange system that every bank in the world uses, and Iran is on the verge of being thrown out of that system, which would totally cripple their capacity to finance any transaction at all. Their currency has been deeply devalued. There's a black market in dollars. Commodity prices are soaring. Tankers are sitting outside their ports unwilling to unload. So there is at least the possibility, and it is worth pursuing that possibility rather than taking military action now, which I think has only a marginal chance of success, particularly if it's done by Israel, which will strengthen the regime and which can lead to all sorts of unintended consequences. We need to go through this, but I'll tell you, if you had asked me as a former Deputy Treasury Secretary if I would have supported going after the Central Bank of Iran even a year ago, I would have said, no, that's too dangerous, or taking them out of the SWIFT system. But this is what we're down to. We are down to having to take those kinds of actions or face a military confrontation on the one hand, or a nuclear-armed Iran, or at least a nuclear-capable Iran or other. And neither of those options, to me, is a very good option. So we should take the firmest, strongest action we can possibly take on sanctions, and I think and hope that they can work. Let me close with one last global force, and that's global warming. I was, as the Dean mentioned, the chief U.S. negotiator for the Kyoto Protocols. I would say the late, not lamented Kyoto Protocol. They never really got off the ground in this country. But this is a serious issue for all of you young people. The last 50 years were the warmest half century in 600 years. And notwithstanding what we hear in some of the party primaries, or at least one of the party primaries, there is a greenhouse effect. It is at least partially man-made, and it will reach unsustainable temperature increases over the next 25 to 30 years that will cause melting of glaciers, rising sea levels, stronger hurricanes, and droughts in many areas. It can be attacked, and it has to be attacked. A recent U.S. National Intelligence estimate said that climate change was not just an environmental challenge, but a major national security threat, creating what they called eco-migrants, who will be leaving their homes and countries in search of water and livable space, clashing with others seeking to protect their own depleted water resources. We can achieve two objectives at once: reducing our own dependence on foreign oil And the biggest component of our trade deficit is oil. We don't think about it. We go to China, China's, it's oil. So we can help ourselves there, and we can also strike a blow for climate change. And maybe the way to sell it politically, and I'm for selling it any damn way you can, is to talk about energy security and energy independence and conservation as being a way of making us less dependent. If it means not talking about climate change, but we accomplish the same thing, I'm all for it, as long as we act. Now, the European Union is serious about this. They have ratified Kyoto. But permit me to say that even in the U.S., with all the negative headlines, there are some slivers of hope. California, this year, has a cap system like Kyoto with cap and trade. If it were a country, it would be the 7th largest country in the world. It's legally binding on all corporations operating in California. They have to meet gradually and quite significantly reduced emissions. A dozen northeastern states, including Pennsylvania, are part of a system in which utilities are legally bound to dramatically decrease their emissions over the next 10 to 15 years. Major corporations have joined groups like USChina and the Pew Center and others, and have committed themselves to mark, and I see this in UPS and in other corporations I'm on the board of, they are developing their own global footprint, Dean, and they are committing themselves to their shareholders and stockholders to reduce that global footprint. I mean, with UPS, it's hybrid trucks, it's more efficient delivery systems, more efficient engines on airplanes. I've chaired the Coca-Cola International Advisory Board. They've got a major water neutrality concept. Companies get it, even if politicians don't. And so this is going to happen from the bottom up. Will it happen fast enough? Maybe not, but it is happening. And one last thing which is positive is that I still have the scars at Kyoto from China and India saying, you guys are the ones who created global warming. We're just starting our industrial revolution. Who are you to tell us to cut our emissions when you caused the problem? And they were right. But they have an obligation to act, and now they're beginning to do so. China's newest 5-year plan, which just came out, and they follow their 5-year plans, and they're good at achieving them. It has a growth rate assumed of 8%, but for the first time, they have a commitment to curb the growth of their emissions. They're building one coal-fired power plant a week. But they are pledged to do that. And at Durban, just a couple of weeks ago, for the first time, there was a consensus by developing countries, we still have to flesh out how this is going to legally be done, that they too will be part of the solution, not just finger-pointing at the West. But that also comes back to us. We're still the largest emitter in the world, and we have to show that we're committed to do this as well. What does all of this mean? In one paragraph, it means to me that all of you will grow up in the most exciting, incredibly interesting century in human history. That you have the capacity as leaders to help shape these global trends, to help make this a truly more integrated, more tolerant, more prosperous world. You're getting the right training for it at this great law school. And, my challenge to you is go out and do it. And do it in the most exciting time in human history. Thank you. was working as President Carter's chief domestic advisor by Russell Long, who was then the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, through which much of our legislation went from Louisiana. And if you remember your American history, his father was Huey Long, the governor, the so-called kingfisher, all the king's men story. And he told the following story, that when he was growing up in the governor's mansion in Baton Rouge, Papa came home stone cold drunk one night and staggered up the stairs and with a very shaky hand got the key in the keyhole to finally align, opened the door, and Russell, young lad on the other side of the door, holding on to Mama's apron strings, saw Papa just collapse in the foyer, and Mama, with her hands crossed, looking sternly down on the governor of the great state of Louisiana, waiting for an explanation as to how this could have occurred. And Russell said, Papa said the following, Mama, I've completed my prepared remarks, and I'll now take questions from the floor. The dean only gave me water, but I'll take questions.
We have literally about a couple minutes, and then we should head out for the reception. So, questions?
This International Atomic Energy Agency, which Iran's a member of, I think, didn't Iran enter into a treaty to be able, this is some years ago, to be able to peacefully produce
yes, the deal, yes, you're right.
Nuclear.
Yeah, the deal is when you become a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as Iran is, you are entitled to a civilian program if you cooperate with the IAEA in answering all their questions and allowing them full inspection of your facilities. And what's brought 4 sets of UN Security Council sanctions, which, by the way, Russia and China agreed to, although they tried to dilute them to pass it, but they did agree, was their failure to abide by those NPT commitments. And just this very week, okay? Well, I guess it was at the end of last week's Monday, but this past weekend, the head of the IAEA, Amano, said that his most recent IAEA trip by their inspectors was a total failure because Iran would not allow them access to the facilities they wanted to determine whether or not Iran's program was truly civilian or whether it was nuclear. I mean, it's a very easy way for Iran to solve this problem. We don't need bombs and we don't need sanctions. All they need to do is say to the IAEA, we're going to abide by the commitment we made when we signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and come in and look at us. We have nothing to hide. If they have something to hide, which they must, that's when the problem occurs.
So you've been very close to international relations, international trade. You run the International Department of Covington and Burling. What are the implications, if any, for training lawyers today? Does the increased globalization change what we should be doing here at the law school, or is it still enough to be?
That's really a good question. I mean, we had as I mentioned to Ed and to the dean before we started, we just had a firm retreat for Covington and Burling, and we've had offices in Brussels and London for a number of years. We opened one in China, in Beijing, 2 years ago. We're going to open two this year, one in Shanghai and one in Seoul, to take advantage of the free trade agreement, which previously did not permit U.S. lawyers to practice law in South Korea. And now on a phased basis, the FTA does just that. Now, what does that mean in terms of law training? One of the things we talked about is not necessarily that you're going to want to train people to move to Seoul or to Shanghai, although I can tell you, if you want a good job and you know Chinese or Korean, that is a great place to practice. Even if you don't, it's still a great place. But increasingly, transactional work and other work is going to involve, in a globalized world, understanding other cultures, being able to work with lawyers of different cultures, having a global understanding. There's really no such thing as a domestic law practice in any major firm anymore. Let's take an example. One of the things I'm actually most proud of during the Carter years is helping create, develop, and negotiate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and then some 20 years later, when I was Undersecretary of State, negotiating the Anti-Corruption Convention of the OECD. So you say, well, the FCPA is a domestic issue. I mean, you know, what's international about that? What's international is that it is the developing country companies which are most at risk if they're doing business with any U.S. entity of coming into conflict with the FCPA, because corruption is endemic in many of these countries. And so they ask us, wait a minute, what's this FCPA? We're going global now. They're going global. Indian companies, Colombian companies, Brazilian companies are going global. And so they want to know about that. They want to know about tax havens. And, you know, so all of this means to me that the concept of international law as we know it was too confined, and that we need to be training law students who understand the world and who appreciate that many of our domestic laws have profound international implications, that they have to understand that, and they ought to be taught that it's the impact of that that we're reading. I mean, another example is FACTA. FACTA is requiring certain disclosure by international banks of their U.S. account holders who may be hiding their assets and not paying taxes. So they're all now rushing and saying, what's this FACTA all about? You know, so all of these things have global impacts, and therefore one ought to train lawyers to understand those global impacts, even in the context of domestic legislation. And antitrust. I mean, antitrust is a global thing now. You know, we do, our firm as a Brussels office does a lot, and Washington office, a lot of international antitrust work. I mean, Microsoft had to do fairly well, and there are all sorts of mergers, acquisitions, and others involving U.S. companies that have to get a checkoff from the European Union, and increasingly now China's got its own antitrust authority. India's going to be setting its own antitrust authority up. So all of this means that there's no such thing as a domestic course, except maybe property law, and don't learn too much about how to package mortgages and make them into securities.
Ambassador Eizenstat, this has been a wonderful whole lecture, and it's a wonderful note to end it on a call to arms about studying international law. I will say that I think in the course of your lecture, you probably hit essentially every international issue that's on the public stage today, and ended up with a reasonably optimistic view about where we are, and especially optimistic view about us all going to law school so we can study this. In any event, I want to invite everybody. We have an opportunity to ask further questions of our whole lecture, but we've really gone well beyond our time. I'd like to